We say, well, listen, what do you have for stranded power? And they're like, well, we have like 70% of our electricity is kind of running past us in the water, and we don't get to monetize it. So we say, well, what if we bring a container load of Bitcoin miners, plunk them down in the site right next to your hydro turbine, and we'll put a Starlink up, and then we will help you fully monetize the rest of your energy.
Eric, it is great to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Yeah, Jordan, thanks for having me on. I'm happy to be here and good to be talking.
Yeah, it's been a long time. I've been wanting to have you on the show. I've been a big advocate from the sidelines of Gridless and like watching what you've been building from the sidelines. So it's good to actually finally have you on here. I was doing a little bit of digging into your like background and how you got to where you are right now. And it is very interesting. Like you've got such a like an amazing background in it. It kind of makes sense how you've got to where you are now. You've been such a big advocate for technology and empowerment in Africa. So would you be able to just take me quickly through like where it all started, and maybe go back to, I just watched a TED talk of yours from, I think it was 2009. Sorry, I'm digging all this up. I'm not
That's
sure.
fine.
But yeah, if you could just take me on, yeah, your background, that would be amazing.
Yeah, so I've been involved in the tech world for a while. Yeah, so going back to 2009, the year before, we had built a software platform for crowdsourcing crisis information during the post-election violence in Kenya, when the whole country kind of fell apart. And the lesson learned from that was that there's a lot of top-down information around the world that comes from the likes of, well, the government, the media itself, or in the case of Africa, a lot of NGOs who have a big footprint. And but it's really hard to ground truth. And if you're an ordinary person, how do you get your information out that something happened or that you need some help with something? And and so that was built in very beginning of 2008, early January 2008. And we built a software platform called Ushahidi that would just allow anybody in the country to send a message in. And so sometimes they would email it, sometimes they would send it to an SMS, sometimes they would, upload it to the website, whatever it was. And, in early 2008, while there was, Twitter and Facebook in the West, nobody in very few people in East Africa used them. Most people had, candy bar phones, not smartphones, even in the West weren't a big thing yet. And so, you needed something that was super simple. And it was just like a way for information to flow differently than it had in the past. Right. And so that was what we had built. So Ushahidi was that. And then, when I talked at TED in 2009, I was talking about this new, blend on this technology that we had been working through, which we called Swift River, which was a way that we could pull in data from multiple forms, from different platforms as well as individuals as they needed it, and then make more sense of that information faster. So you fast forward, what is that, like 16 years ago, 17 years ago? And all of a sudden, I mean, that stuff's operating. You see different apps and services and AI tools that make all this stuff possible that, we struggled with heavily at the time. But yeah, my background is in software and kind of building web tools and web services. And then that went into, like you're right. My history doesn't make sense if you just hear like this, and this. But if you follow the flow, they're actually, I hope,
There's a
there's
thread.
continuity to it.
Yeah.
So, and I'll tell you what happened next. So we built the iHub next, which is the innovation hub in Kenya. It was actually back in 2008 too, where a bunch of us software people were sitting around in Nairobi. We had just had our first, we had a bar camp, so at a non-conference where people just kind of vote with their feet with where they want to go and listen to who's talking. And we were sitting around afterwards saying, why is it we only meet once or twice a year as tech guys in Kenya? What if we had a place of our own? And that was the seed that was planted that would eventually become the iHub. And the iHub we built in 2010. Um, Nobody thought there was enough tech people in Africa. We couldn't get any funding for it from anybody. So Ushahidi just used our own money to build it. And then it grew and expanded to like 17,000 members, 4 floors in a building. It was huge. Um, but I've always been more entrepreneurial minded, and building things is normal for me. Trying to solve like a big issue, a thorny issue, with new kind of creative ways of finding a solution. And so what you see with Gridless today is similar to what you saw with Ushahidi or the iHub or even Break afterwards, which is like each company, each organization are solving some bigger issue, but coming at it from a completely different angle and saying, hey, sometimes the innovation is not in the tech, it's in the model. And I think that's what you see today with Gridless as well. It's like the innovation is not in the tech. I mean, we've been doing Bitcoin mining for well over a decade now, and so none of the tech is new.
Yeah, it was really interesting, like looking at that thread, and like how you got to Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. But how did you come across Bitcoin in the first place? Um,
Yeah.
what's the story behind that, getting there?
Well, remember again, we were the tech guys, right? Back in those days, and so we we heard about it very early. And I remember building the iHub in 2010, and we already all knew about Bitcoin. There was people playing around with it, and you could see somebody open their laptop and saying, "Hey, you can make this thing with your computer," right? But I didn't really look into it very deeply. I was curious enough to know what it was, but not curious enough to like get into it at all and have any conviction on it. Um, the next year, we built the supercomputer cluster at the iHub, and this was, the first of its kind in East Africa, and it was built so that the community of software engineers could, do parallel programming. They could figure out how to build, because we built this our own from scratch. So build the computer itself, as well as use it for different types of applications or services that they wanted to run. And so we had a whole server room that was set up that people could run and host their own projects and everything on it. And the supercomputer cluster came in and was a part of that. And I kept thinking, we had this, Bitcoin thing. We should use our, if you can do it on a laptop computer, you should be able to mine a lot more with a big computer like the supercomputer cluster that we had. And, so I mentioned it a number of times to the guys running it, but, it was more like, hey, this would be cool to do. And again, I had no conviction on it. And they didn't either. They thought it was even crazier than I did. And so we never did it. So that's, that was the story of me and Bitcoin mining specifically. Like every time I've been dealing with Bitcoin, it's been about the mining side. Then there's, touch points in 2010, 2011, 2014, 2016. And then finally in 2022, I just said, you know what, I'm done with talking about this and never doing something. I'm going to do Bitcoin mining. What's the way to do Bitcoin mining here? And that's how we, got into understanding the energy, situation in Africa, and or at least starting to figure it out. And then Gridless was eventually born. But yeah, realistically, we probably should have built it in 2010. And actually, this, the thing is not a personal wealth story for me too. I wish we had done it in 2010 for a very specific reason. Any Bitcoin we had mined as the iHub would not have been mine. I wouldn't have been wealthy from it, but the iHub would have been. The iHub was this kind of a thing that's a foundation, right, for the tech community in Nairobi. And that meant that any funding that came in there could be spent on the startups in the tech ecosystem. So if we had done that properly, we would have had enough financing for many, many years of the startups coming from our part of Africa. And I think that would have been phenomenal for the whole industry. And it would have been good for Bitcoin too.
Yeah, definitely. And you're based in Nairobi, is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. I live and work here in Nairobi. I grew up in Kenya for people who don't know.
Yeah, I just realized that people might not know. um, so let's move on to Gridless then. So you started getting interested in the energy side of things, looking at energy within. Where were you specifically looking at that time? Was iHub in Kenya?
Yeah, so I was in Nairobi.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so you're talking about 2010 Bitcoin and what we were thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just that story about like using the supercomputer cluster and using it for that. But no, the gridless thing wasn't on the books yet, of course, at all. It took me looking at it again in 2014, and this was my current business partner, Philip Walton, myself, and another startup founder named Reg. We had started a company called Brick, which was building, actually designing and engineering routers from the ground up in Africa for use in our kind of environment. So we really, the story of Brick was really understanding how hardware worked and how to build your own hardware and design hardware for the African environment. And but it was in that time frame we had just started Brick, and we heard about this 300 plus megawatt wind farm that was built in northern Kenya that was stranded. They had no way to get, there's no transmission lines across the desert down to the populated parts of the country, and it wasn't going to have those transmission lines for years. And so, Philip, I remember Philip saying, "Hey, let's get some Bitcoin miners and get some containers and just throw them up there. We can figure out the cooling thing, I'm sure." And I just remember looking over at him. We're in our little, office, the size of this room I'm in, because when you're starting companies, you're kind of just you're in dumpy little places. And I said, "Philip, we just raised money for this other company. We can't and do something else now too." And so of course we didn't. But that was another time where we looked at it and we're like, oh, that would make a lot of sense. Could we do the connectivity? And we're thinking about satellites and everything. And, yeah, it could be done. But, we have something else we need to build. And then a few years later, 2016, was 2016 or 2017? Whenever the S9s were coming out. And I was about to pull the trigger on 10 of them on my own, because the lease for our office included electricity. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to plug, 10 of these in a closet somewhere and let them run, and just see what happens. And then some land became available up country, on a nice river, and has some cottages. I was like, let me buy these cottages instead for the family. So I ended up doing that. So each time there's always something I was like, oh, it doesn't make sense. Oh, I need to spend the money on something else. Oh, and it was really, if you think about it, it was really because I lacked conviction in what Bitcoin was, or I didn't really know what it was. And it wasn't until COVID hit that I finally had the desire to understand the whole space. And it was literally like 4 months of listening to podcasts, reading a ton, that I started to really understand what Bitcoin is. And I was like, oh, okay, now I get it. Realistically, I needed to understand not just what Bitcoin is and what it does, but now what are all these other altcoins? And and so I had to, part of that 4 months was really understanding what altcoins were doing. Of course, I'd seen the ICO craze of 2017. I had, but I didn't really grok the difference between all of them yet, right? And so again, that deep dive for those months allowed me to see, and if all of my organizations have been built off of this, off of a long-term view of the world, which is you build a solid foundation, you make something that really matters, and that's what ensures your long-term viability. And it's better to build something solid long-term than to do some flash in the pan thing that just makes some money. And so I just was like, okay, ICOs and these altcoins, some of them can be good programming platforms, but they're not good money. Anything I do on that front is really about making fast money, but I'm not interested in fast money. I'm interested in good money, and I'm interested in a foundation of building a business that can be there for the long term. And so I can just shove all the altcoin stuff off the end of the table. I don't need to think of or work on them anymore, and I can just focus on Bitcoin. And so that's what we did, and that's when Gridless was born.
It's such a so many people I talk to now is I kind of think the pandemic and COVID was like almost like a secret weapon for learning about Bitcoin because it just
Yeah.
made everybody slow down. And it's just surprising how many people, myself included, actually used that time to learn about what Bitcoin actually was. At that point, I was into cryptocurrency,
Mm-hmm.
and it took me that time to actually figure out, oh, these are actually different. And it is about looking long term, lowering your time preference. Um, but yeah, it's
When
just
did
very
you realize they were different?
what made me.
Mm-hmm.
So the story I always tell is, have you read the book The Fourth Turning?
I haven't.
So it's actually not a Bitcoin book, and it's a book about the cycles that we go through as society. Like every
Yeah.
80 years, we've got
There's these.
different turnings,
Yeah.
and then we're currently in a fourth turning, and like resetting. But it took me that like reading that book to actually, as you were saying, like zoom out and look long term.
Mm-hmm.
And then you look at these coins that are they've got the founders behind them, they've got marketing teams behind them,
Yeah.
um, all of this, and it just becomes so obvious after that. But you kind of need that zooming out to be able to see. And looking back in history was a big thing, and I hadn't done a lot of research
Right.
before that time. Um, and yeah, the pandemic seems to be, or the COVID seems to be a time that it clicked for a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, and so you're the fourth turn. I haven't read the book, but of course I'm familiar with the concept, and and I think the book that probably had the biggest impact on me during that period of reading and listening was the Sovereign Individual, and I
Yes.
think equally because it looked at history, right?
Yeah.
And it talks you. It takes a while to get to the point, but it does so for a reason, and I think, yeah, just having the time to read the books. I'm an avid reader, so I probably end up reading about 80 books a year, but the choice of which book you read is as important as the fact that you read books.
Yeah. And what order you read them in as well is quite important because if I was to, someone new to Bitcoin and I was to give them the sovereign individual, that wouldn't go down too well.
No.
It's a difficult read. It took me quite a few like goes
Yeah.
at getting through it, but it's an important book to actually read as well. Um, but yeah, you're right. Like looking like books are such an important resource.
Well, what other books for you? I'm curious because you've got the Fourth Turning. We just mentioned the Sovereign Individual. What other books are the ones that are on your kind of like, okay, these two or three are kind of are the ones you should read?
Okay, I'm gonna ask the same question back to you, so just prepare. But I would have, um, so for beginner, like very, very, if someone's completely new to Bitcoin and they know nothing about it, I actually, this is a bit of a curveball one, but it's Hard Money, um, is it called Hard Money? Or Money You Can't Fuck With by Jason A. Williams, just because it tells the story of Bitcoin. It tells Bitcoin through a story, and
Yeah.
it's really engaging. And then of course we've got Jeff Booth's book, The Price of
Yeah.
Tomorrow. That is a must for anyone. And the the Bitcoin Standard has to be in there at some point. Um, but I'm not sure where that would come in all of the books. And then you've got the really or a bit more complex ones further down the line when now you've got Larry Lepard's in there, and then you've got
Yeah.
Lynn Alden's book.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, there's so many now, which is great because there wasn't like back in 2017 when I was first trying to get into it. Um, but yeah, I'm gonna bounce that over to you. What would be your three?
Gosh. So, actually one's an essay. So the bullish case for Bitcoin,
Yes.
um, is I think a good kind of short read that I found useful. Um, yeah, the book that I really do like, and I actually recommend to people who are either a certain level in business or are investors, is actually Lynn Alden's Broken Money, because I think that for a certain type of reader is a really good, or a businessman or somebody who understands a certain level of kind of I guess not money or monetary anything, but just understanding economics a little bit is useful.
Yep.
One of the earlier books I read too, was, shoot, what's it called? I'm forgetting the name of it. But Alex's first book, um,
Uh,
Alex
um,
Gladstein's book on,
yeah, I've totally forgot it as well.
the name. I have it
But
right here. Let me see if I can find it.
I can picture it. Um,
Yeah, it's
it
somewhere on my shelf over here. I can't find it. We'll find it later.
yeah,
Um, but and I liked that just because it was, and that was almost, I think that was launching like right as it's like right before we launched Gridless. So it was like really, well, I wasn't learning about Bitcoin anymore, but it was, and I wasn't actually super into the use of Bitcoin. All right. I was into the, how do you make Bitcoin? Right. And so I was like, oh yeah, there's people who use it around the world too. And that's an important part of Bitcoin's makeup, right? So, Gladstein's kind of view on how it's being used around the world by people
it's
in
called
hard places.
check your financial privilege.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah,
Check
check.
your financial privilege. So
Yeah,
that was useful for me to kind of just make sure I'm not thinking about it just one dimensional, but I was thinking about it kind of, like Bitcoin can be used in all these different ways by all these different parties and people, and that, Bitcoin really is for everyone. And just as much as it can be used by your activists in really hard situations in a tough country, it can also be used by the same dictators in that same country. And therein Bitcoin has its value as well. So, yeah, no, I, anyway, so, the books and the learning about it were important along this journey.
yeah, and I think that's a really important point that what I used to or how I used to describe it was Bitcoin's kind of like a knife. Like a knife can be used for to stab someone, but a knife can also be used by a surgeon to save someone.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter. It's not the knife's fault. It can be used for good and it can be used for bad. But the
Yeah,
important thing is it's neutral. And
yeah,
that's for a lot of people. It's really new people coming in, it's difficult to think of it like that because that's why people get attached to it's used for illicit activity. For
yeah,
but there's so many that's why like learning about Bitcoin you never stop because there's so many different avenues you can go down, and this is why I'm going to bring this onto Gridless now. This is why I love what you're doing at Gridless. So for people that don't know what Gridless is, what is it and what is it that you do?
and simply put, it's Gridless is a Bitcoin mining company. And anybody who doesn't know about Bitcoin and mining will be like, what is that? So, what we do, Bitcoin miners look for inexpensive electricity all over the world, energy that isn't being, that is either cheap enough or is stranded. Stranded being not being used for anything. And then they put these really, like really crappy computers. They're like, as my business partner Philip likes to say, the world's worst built computers, um, that just do one simple thing and run them there, and that that energy that's used runs these compute cycles that help us to, secure the network. It's or like the way proof of what we call proof of work is allows us to show that we've actually used this much energy over this much amount of time, so that we can then um, be that security layer of the Bitcoin network that allows all the spending of Bitcoin on top of it to really make a lot of sense, to really work for everybody. Um, I won't actually get into the theoretical too much because I think that's a rabbit hole that gets really deep and confusing to people. But I'll just say that, so the Bitcoin mining is where new Bitcoin enters the world. And we also get paid for every transaction that's happened in Bitcoin over that same 10-minute period where a new block is being formed. But what is it? So practically speaking, what do we do? Right. So we have what we'll do is we'll go find stranded power. So Gridless really looks for renewable energy that's in a place where they can't sell it to anybody else. It's completely stranded. So often this looks like you're in a rural area. Most of the time it's somebody who's built a small run of river site, that in some rural part of Kenya or Malawi or Zambia, and the community there uses it and buys it, but they only buy maybe 30% of the energy. The other 70% could be made into electricity, but nobody else will buy it. There's not enough users. And, at first that's confusing to people. They're like, what do you mean? If there's more electricity, why would more people just buy it? Or why wouldn't you buy more? Well, it's because when you're in this rural community, you don't have a lot of disposable income. And, usually these are agricultural environments. People are growing their own food on their own farms. And maybe they have a cash crop, something like that. But they need the power. At first, when they get the chance to get electricity, everybody wants electricity, right? It's like, as I always say, it's like that. It's like this baseline for human progress, right? If you don't have electricity, then you're always going to be behind those that do. And the reason is that the electricity does things for you, like helps you pay to buy a pump and irrigate your fields. Where usually that would have taken tens of hours of taking buckets or hoses of water from the river and trying to get it to your location, or waiting just for the rainy season. It's because it provides power to the local clinic, and the local clinic can now cool medicines and keep them cold. And they can also be open at night because there's electricity and they have lights. It means that people can buy LED light bulbs for their homes and no longer use paraffin lamps. It's, there's extra security in the community because now there's more lights around. The husbands tend to stay at home more because they can go 200 meters down to the local kiosk or Duka and watch the Premier League football match instead of going 10 kilometers away to the closest town to do that. So like there's all these benefits for electricity, but so people should be buying all this electricity, but they don't have the disposable income yet. All right. So, it turns out, an LED light bulb and charging your phone just doesn't take very much power. And so what we've seen is that, you'll get after 5-10 years of running your site, 30% of the power is being used. And so the company who built the energy is saying, okay, well, we've got to charge more money for our electricity. So they're charging anywhere from, 30 cents to over $1 per kilowatt hour. Now, I can't remember off the top of my head what the average for kind of consumer electricity is in the UK. Do you know what it is off the top of your head?
I don't know off the top of my head, unfortunately.
So why don't you chat GPT that or Google that real quick, and I'll tell you what it is in the US. The US, it averages around 12 cents per kilowatt hour. Here in Nairobi, in the city, we were at about 22 cents per kilowatt hour. And again, in the rural villages, it's 30 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's actually more expensive for people in the village to buy electricity than it is for their urban counterparts. And so the people with the least disposable income have to spend the most relative amount of cost for their electricity. Did you find the UK?
Yeah, it is. What did you say the US was?
US is around 12 cents per kilowatt hour, kind of nationwide.
Okay, so apparently, as of the 1st of April 2025, the average cost of electricity in the UK will be 27 pence per kilowatt hour.
That's expensive.
No, we are one of the most expensive in the
That's
world,
crazy.
actually. And it's, yeah, they've just gone up. So, and that's pence as well. So that'll come out
Yeah,
at
more expensive. 30 cents.
32, maybe,
Yeah, 30.
cents.
Well, I mean, you can rest assured that you're spending about the same amount as the rural villagers in Kenya or Malawi are, which is kind of crazy when you're in one of the more developed countries in the world, right? Where you have really good grid interconnects and you have so much abundant energy there.
We've got,
Um,
the painful thing is that, yeah, as we were saying before, in the UK, before we started recording, in the UK, we've got so much of this stranded energy that's not getting utilized. Um, and unfortunately, just the way that these farms get subsidized by the government, they're not incentivized to actually run miners or change any of the transmission. Um,
because they
that's
get they get paid whether or not anybody in the country is using it, right?
exactly, yeah.
So that's what we call take or pay, right? So a take and pay contract means that you only get paid for the energy that's used, and take or pay means you get paid as the energy company no matter if it's used or not. The fact is that you generated it, and therefore you get paid for it.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of thing is really probably maybe it's at the heart of energy development, even in Africa, right? So people want to get a take or pay agreement with the government. And to get that, the government has to think really strategically, decades in advance of what energy needs are going to be. And so it's a tough problem for them to solve. Yet, nobody wants to throw down, a couple £100 million or dollars to build a site unless they have some assurances that they're going to have a good stream of revenue coming into it. And therein lies the problem for grid connected power. Now, what Gridless does is we are on grid. We're places where there is no grid, or if there's a grid, there's only a local grid, and there's no interconnect to the national utility at all. And so, what happens in those areas is that there's no other choice for people. That is the only choice. And of course, they're always happy when new electricity comes in because anything is better than nothing. An LED light bulb is better than no LED light bulb. Charging your phone is better, with power that comes to your home is a great deal better than the old way of doing it, which was you would either go into the central part of the village and somebody there would have bought, one or two, three car batteries. They would charge them up, and then they would charge people to charge their phones up, and then once or twice a week they would take those batteries on the back of a motorcycle out to a bigger town, recharge them, and then bring them back. Right. So that was the best option before. So these are the kind of things that are happening. So, you look at that and you're like, okay, well, you can see why electricity in a community is so big, is so important. But for the energy company, they also have a problem that they're selling 30% of their power. So of course their prices have to be expensive for that electricity, and they're not making as much money as they thought they were going to make. It is a problem. So, along comes, Gridless, and we say, well, listen, what do you have for stranded power? And they're like, well, we have like 70% of our electricity is kind of running past us in the water, and we don't get to monetize it. So we say, well, what if we bring a container load of Bitcoin miners, plunk them down in the site right next to your hydro turbine, and we'll put a Starlink up, and then we will help you fully monetize the rest of your energy. And that's what we've done. So we have 6 sites, 4 hydro, 1 geothermal, and 1 biomass. We're in 3 countries, in Kenya, Malawi, and Zambia. and we're going to be expanding to a new country this year. But yeah, it's working. I think if there's anything, the last Gridless is only 2.5 years old, so we're a fairly young company. But if there's anything that I think that Gridless has taught all of us is the first thing is that Bitcoin mining isn't some evil thing because it uses a lot of energy. In fact, that's a superpower. The second thing is that you can monetize and make profitable stranded energy. More importantly, maybe said a better way is you can make off-grid energy profitable, which was really, really, really hard to do before, right? Because when you're off-grid in rural Africa, there's no big industry that's going to set up there, generally speaking, right? So there's no big anchor tenant. There's just the consumers, maybe a few, grain mills, maybe the local cell phone towers. Every once in a while, you'll get a tea farm or a little coffee farm, but that's it. And so, you need something that can be a large anchor tenant to take up the rest of that energy demand and put it to use. And that's what we do.
What what Gridless really taught me, because as I said, like I've been following you since like inception at the very start. I think it was Obi that very first got me, or pointed me towards. But what it's really taught me is when you think about Bitcoin mining, a lot of people think about it as what we see in Texas, huge, just farms of machines, and just on a commercial scale.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, what this shows me, and what I've learned over the last few years is like how much it can actually impact rural communities, and as you said, like enable them to have electricity because they can monetize that extra 70%, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
What made you go down that route? Because you were investigating or going into Bitcoin mining over the last decade. What made you go down this route rather than just setting up a large scale Bitcoin mining farm?
So, when you're looking at Bitcoin mining, you have to look at where there is cheap power, right? And so if you're buying grid connected power in Africa, you'll never be profitable with Bitcoin mining. There is some cases where you can find stranded national generation, right? So large, hydro in Ethiopia or Uganda or Nigeria or wherever there's large amounts of it that are available and they're not being used. Mostly not because there's not the potential demand in the country, there's not the transmission to those people. The utility isn't there. And so, but we were looking at power and we're just looking around. And we're like, okay, well, it doesn't make sense to do the grid. What else would make sense? Let's call up the guys who build their own small power and see what's going on. And that's what drove us into it. So, we didn't know a whole lot about the energy world. We had to call and find out from everybody else what's going on. But, I think coming into a new space and not having any background in it, but having a solution for a need in that industry is really valuable. We came in, we said, okay, this is what we can do. We made some relationships happen. We started building out our first sites, so we were able to get the power. We don't pay directly for our power. We have a revenue share with that power partner. So instead of spending, 7 cents or 8 cents per kilowatt hour, we're not spending anything. And that means the operational cost for us is lower. But what it unlocked was like this curiosity, which is, okay, so sure, we're doing the Bitcoin mining. It's working. Great. There's other sites and we're opening them up all the time, but how does this energy thing work? And why are there still 600 million people in Africa who don't have any electricity? Just asking that question and looking into it, reading a bunch of papers, reports, research documents on how mini grids in Africa are built, how they're funded, how, the financing of everything, the real numbers on what happens once you build them. And I was like, oh, I know why. I know why they're not being built. They're not being built because they're a really bad investment. Like if you're getting 30% usage on your electricity, guess what? You're gonna have a hard time breaking even. And most people don't know this, but for like a run of river hydro site, you're gonna spend $2 million to build 1 megawatt. of energy. And that's, that's not a small amount of capital for most people to come up with. And so, what happens is you have these energy developers who see the same problem, say, oh, we could make this. And they're going around we've done the research on this area. We've done our feasibility studies. We've got the approvals. Can we get, $2.5 million to build this? And people look at the numbers and say, no, because there's a long history of failed, off-grid energy sites in Africa. So, I wrote a paper 2 years ago now. I said, well, why don't you just put Bitcoin mining and energy development together and go build it at the same time? And if you do that, it turns out you'll make your return on investment for both expenses in 5 to 7 years. And so I just wrote the paper, put it out there, talked about it at a few locations where I was on stage, and then nobody was doing it. And I was like, why is nobody doing this? And, there's just a whole industry built up around this other model. And so as we were sitting there as Gridless, we were saying, well, we're going to still find more stranded energy from other partners all over the continent. But there's again, 600 million people who don't have electricity. If we just do a basic mapping exercise on those who don't have energy and the places that have good hydro, for example, right? For like 10 megawatts and under sites, turns out there's like 400 gigawatts of available energy across Africa at just 10 megawatts and under. So why are people not building these things out? And why don't we just build some of them out? So out of that, we came up with a new arm of the business, which is called Gridless Energy. And that's what we're doing. We're raising the capital right now, but we're using this kind of basic model, right? Which is, you can build this new energy and you can have a new site that can sell wholesale to the community and also has 100% utility from day one because Bitcoin mining's on it, right? But number two, and we've already proven the profitability of that model. We know it works, right? So, but the other side of this equation is the financing side. So at first we thought, oh, let's just do project financing for, with $20 million, we could go build 10 megawatts of run-of-river hydro. We'll make it profitable in 5 to 7 years, good full ROI, and away we go. And we have, you mentioned Obi earlier, so we have investors like Obi, Jeff Booth, or just different people that we have in our wheelhouse, and they said to us, "You're a Bitcoin company. Why are you denominating this in dollars?" And we're like, "What? What do you mean?" They're like, well, if you turn that same $20 million into Bitcoin, what could you do with it? And like, well, I don't know. What could you do with it? Well, they said, well, there's banks, there's companies that will, if you take that same $20 million and you put it into, and you make, today would be like 215 Bitcoin or 210 Bitcoin, something like that, to turn to 210 Bitcoin, use that as collateral with a multi-sig with a Swiss bank, you can get 50% loan to value on that. And with an 8%, 9% interest rate. We're like, oh, we had no idea. So back to the spreadsheets, back to understanding how that could work. And, we're like, oh my goodness, there's this like endless energy glitch in Africa. It's like the perfect storm. We have these vast areas with massive amounts of free energy inputs, water. We have vast populations who need that electricity. And we have Bitcoin, which we can lock up, and that Bitcoin ends up going up in value every year too. So every year, well, again, you have to make sure your model prepares for that inevitable down year every 4 years, but be disciplined about it and good about your model. You can actually have, $20 million worth of Bitcoin the first year, and that's worth 28 million the next year and 45 the next year. So every year you actually have more Bitcoin to utilize to draw down more for more energy. But that alone wouldn't work if you weren't doing what? Building a prime asset like energy and making more Bitcoin. That Bitcoin, of course, pays off your loans, but eventually you've got this flywheel going where you're actually making more Bitcoin than you're spending to cover your costs of your loan, and you're adding more Bitcoin to the top. So now I don't have 210, I have 212. The next year I have 220. And the next year I have 235, and you have more Bitcoin at your disposal over time as well. So that's a very long-winded way of saying this. If I had $20 million of $20 million today, I could build 10 megawatts of run-of-river hydro. And if I wanted to build any more, I'd have to go raise more money. If I take that same $20 million and turn it to Bitcoin, I can build 100 megawatts in 10 years and 4 gigawatts in 30 off that same $20 million, right? That's what we call capital efficiency. That is unequaled anywhere. You cannot do that in any other way, right? And it's because it's this perfect scenario of, like I said, of the Africa context, but mixed with a deflationary currency and an inflationary currency.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it works.
Do you think it can be? So you've written an article all around this, and I loved reading it. And this bit like really stood out to me. I'll put it in the link below so everyone can read it. But do you think this? You shared the model that you use, and all of this. Do you think this is replicable in different continents, or it feels like Africa just has a unique opportunity with this?
Yeah, so I'll start with that. We've been very open with the model because if even in my the perfect world scenario, you develop 4 to 10 gigawatts of energy. Guess what? You're only scratching the surface of the 400 gigawatts available on our continent. So it would be a shame if we were to hold that to our chest and not share it, because we need more people trying to do the same things all over this continent. The question is, can it be used in other continents? Absolutely. But it needs the right makeup of locations that need energy. And you find a lot of that, in Latin America. You find some of that in Asia. You have to be in the right location. So it's not good for every geography, but it is good for some.
Yeah, it's there's a picture. I think it was at the top of your article, which lays out with all the dots of where all these opportunities are, and it's quite incredible just seeing it in that picture form.
Yeah, no, it's vast, and people forget how big Africa is too when they look at that map. Like, you're not only talking like we you think 600 million people. Well, 600 million people is obviously more than live in North America. It's also more than live in Europe. It's a lot of people. That's just those without electricity. There's another 600 million that already have electricity. Okay, so it's a populous continent, and it will continue to grow in population, unlike Europe and the U.S. The second thing is the vast space that's on this continent. It is massive. When we're talking about going places where you're flying for a long time, you're driving for a long time, and so there's really, really big open spaces, which is why it's so unprofitable to build big utility lines, right? It doesn't make sense for them, and that's why the national utility hasn't built to these locations. You've got a not very dense population group in a big area, and you're like, the government itself won't make its money back, and so it won't do that investment. And so the only answer for you is your own local grid, and from your own local energy source. And for us, we always focus on hydro because that is the cheapest LCOE, the cheapest levelized cost of energy for us to build. But there's cases for solar as well, and you've recently seen Tether's announcement on trying to solve this with solar kiosks in certain parts of the continent. It doesn't solve that's a band-aid for electricity, in that it gives you your lights and charges your phones. It doesn't help you with irrigation or running a grain mill, or some of these other things that need a lot more energy. But it is a good help. It's a stepping stone.
I didn't realize that. What is it, just because of the output from hydro to solar compared?
It's the input, right? You only get best 8 hours a day. Yeah. Meanwhile, hydro is rivers are running all day and all night.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. That's us up at time. That has been that has been amazing, just to and find out more about what what you're building, because yeah, it's just incredible. Because as I said, I think a lot of people think of Bitcoin mining just as these large commercial, and they will just see the likes of Texas
Mm.
wind farms, Bitcoin mining farms, sorry, not wind farms, but they are building wind farms as well. Um, but it's really nice to see like the other side of it, of like this is what Bitcoin mining is, and how it can actually use this stranded energy for communities and empower them to have electricity. Because as you said, 600 million is like, that's a lot of people without electricity.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people forget that, as well, as we're sitting here with abundance of electricity.
Yeah, right.
Um,
It is. Well, and I mean, just to kind of put a point on it too, like, the old saying that, a million people is a statistic, a million deaths is a statistic, and a single death is a tragedy. That's what kind of gets mixed up here. Is like 600 million people. As humans, we have a hard time getting our head around like that. That's huge. It can't be that big, you know? So listen, thanks for having me on too, Jordan. This is good to have a conversation with you. I look forward to seeing you, next time. Hopefully I'm in the UK.
I
And
will. I think you're at Cheat Code. Are you at Cheat Code?
yeah, I'll be at Cheat Code. Are you gonna
Yeah.
be there this
All
year?
right. Yeah, I'll see you in a month.
Oh, perfect. See
Amazing.
you in Bedford.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on, and yeah, I'll see you in Bedford.